The two great reservoirs of the Colorado River, Lake Mead and Lake Powell, are so often spoken of in the same breath that most people imagine them to be twins. Two enormous bodies of water sharing the same fate, rising and falling in unison as the drought deepens and eases across the American West. And in a broad sense, that picture is not entirely wrong. For the two reservoirs are indeed bound together, the twin pillars of a single vast system. Both of them fall into alarming and unprecedented lows in the long crisis of the river, both the constant subject of anxious worry and emergency action. But if you look more closely, if you understand the particular position that each of these reservoirs occupies in the great machinery of the Colorado River, a crucial difference emerges, a difference that reveals one of the two to be in significantly more danger than the other. That reservoir is Lake Mead. For all that the two of them are so often joined together as equals in the public imagination, Lake Mead sits in a more precarious position, exposed to forces that press it downward more relentlessly, structurally more vulnerable to decline than its upstream sibling. This is the story of why Lake Mead is in more danger than Lake Powell, of the hidden and often misunderstood asymmetry between the two great reservoirs, and of what that asymmetry reveals about the deepest structural problem at the very heart of the Colorado River crisis, a problem that will shape the future of the entire American West for generations to come. To understand why Lake Mead is in more danger, you first have to understand the fundamental geography of the two reservoirs and how they relate to each other, because their positions in the river system are profoundly different, and it is that difference in position that lies at the root of everything. The Colorado River flows generally from the high mountains of the north down through the deep canyons and the arid deserts of the southwest toward the distant sea, and along its course, the two great reservoirs sit in sequence, one above the other. Lake Powell is the upstream reservoir, held back by Glen Canyon Dam, gathering the water that flows down from the upper-basin. From the mountains of Colorado and Wyoming and Utah and New Mexico, where the snows fall and the tributaries are born, Lake Mead is the downstream reservoir, held back by Hoover Dam, sitting far below Lake Powell, receiving the water that is released from Powell and flows down the river to reach it. Water moves from the upper basin into Lake Powell, and then it is released from Powell downstream to Lake Mead, and from Mead it is delivered onward to the great cities and the vast farms of the lower basin and on across the border toward Mexico at the very end of the line. The two reservoirs are arranged like two buckets in a chain, the upper one feeding the lower, and this simple fact of their arrangement is the beginning of understanding why the lower one is in greater danger. It helps to understand how these two reservoirs came to exist and why they were built where they were, because their very origins shed light on the different burdens they now bear. Hoover Dam, which holds back Lake Mead, was built first, in an earlier era, at a time when the great ambition of the age was to tame the wild and unpredictable Colorado River, to end the destructive floods that had periodically ravaged the lands downstream, and to store the water that would allow the desert southwest to grow. It was one of the monumental engineering achievements of its time, a colossal wall of concrete rising from the floor of a deep canyon, and the reservoir it created, Lake Mead, became the great storage that made possible the growth of the lower basin, the cities and the farms that rose on the strength of its water. Glen Canyon Dam, which holds back Lake Powell, was built later, farther upstream, to serve a different purpose, to allow the upper basin states to store their share of the water and to meet their obligations to deliver water downstream to the lower basin. The two dams, built in different eras and for somewhat different reasons, together came to form the twin anchors of the entire system, the upstream storage and the downstream storage, working in concert to manage a river that had been divided among many users. The reason two great reservoirs were needed, rather than one, goes to the heart of the compromise that governs the Colorado River, the division of the river between an upper basin and a lower basin, each entitled to a share of the water. The lower basin, growing faster and thirstier, needed its own great storage close at hand, and that was Lake Mead. The upper basin, wishing to develop its own share of the water over time and needing to meet its downstream obligations without being drained dry, needed its own storage as well, and that was Lake Powell. And so the two reservoirs came to embody the division of the river itself, the one serving the lower basin directly, the other serving the upper basin and mediating the flow between the two halves. This history matters because it means that the two reservoirs were never truly identical twins, but were built to play different roles. And it is precisely those different roles, the downstream delivery function of Mead and the upstream storage function of Powell, that lie behind the asymmetry and their danger today. To understand why Lake Mead is in more danger, one must understand that it was built to be the workhorse of the lower basin, the reservoir that directly satisfies the enormous demand of the desert Southwest, and it is that role that now exposes it to the greatest peril. Consider first the matter of what feeds each reservoir and what drains it, because this is where the asymmetry begins to reveal itself. Lake Powell, sitting at the top, is fed directly by the natural flow of the river coming down from the upper basin, by the snowmelt and the runoff of the high country that gathers into the river and flows into the reservoir. When the snows are good and the runoff is strong, Lake Powell fills, replenished by the natural bounty of the mountains, its inflow coming directly from the source. Lake Mead, sitting below, is not fed by the natural flow of the river in the same way, because most of that natural flow has already been captured by Lake Powell above it. Instead, Lake Mead is fed primarily by the water that is released from Lake Powell, by the controlled releases that flow down through Glen Canyon Dam and travel down the river to reach it. This means that Lake Mead's inflow is not the natural bounty of the mountains, but the managed release from the reservoir above, a release that is determined by rules and negotiations and the need to balance the two reservoirs, and that may or may not be enough to keep Lake Mead full. Lake Mead, in other words, does not drink directly from the source, but receives its water secondhand, dependent on what is sent down to it from above. Now consider what drains each reservoir, because here the asymmetry grows sharper still. Lake Powell, sitting above, releases its water downstream to Lake Mead, and while it must release a great deal to meet the obligations of the system, its primary function is to store the upper basin's water and to pass a required amount downstream. Lake Mead, sitting below, must supply the enormous demand of the lower basin, the vast thirst of the great desert cities and the sprawling farms of Arizona and Nevada and California, along with the water owed to Mexico. And here is the crucial point. The fact that lies at the very heart of why Lake Mead is in more danger. The demand placed on Lake Mead by the lower basin is enormous, far larger than the demand the upper basin places on its own supply, and this demand, drawing water out of Lake Mead year after year, presses the reservoir downward with a relentless force. The lower basin uses a great deal of water, more than the upper basin uses, and all of that use is drawn from Lake Mead, draining the reservoir to satisfy the thirst of a huge population and a vast agricultural economy. Lake Mead is squeezed between a limited inflow from above and an enormous outflow below, and this squeeze is the essence of its danger. This brings us to one of the most important and least understood concepts in the entire Colorado River crisis, a concept that explains, more than anything else, why Lake Mead is in such peculiar and persistent danger. It is called the structural deficit, and understanding it is the key to understanding the asymmetry between the two reservoirs. The structural deficit refers to the fact that in the lower basin, more water is taken out of Lake Mead each year than flows into it, even in a normal year, even without drought, simply because of the way the system is arranged and the demands that are placed upon it. When you add up all the water that leaves Lake Mead, the water delivered to the cities and farms of the lower basin, the water owed to Mexico, and the enormous quantity lost to evaporation from the surface of the reservoir in the blazing desert heat, and you compare it to the water that flows in from the releases above, you find that the outflow exceeds the inflow by a substantial margin. This means that Lake Mead is structurally destined to decline, to lose water year after year. Not because of drought alone, but because of the fundamental imbalance built into the way the lower basin uses the water, an imbalance that would drain the reservoir even in years of decent supply. The structural deficit is a devastating concept because it means that Lake Mead's decline is not merely a symptom of drought that would reverse when the rains return, but a built-in feature of the system that persists even in normal times. The lower basin, in its accounting of the water, has never fully reckoned with the losses to evaporation and to the transport of the water through the system, and so it has consistently taken more from Lake Mead than the reservoir receives, running a deficit that draws the reservoir down year after year. even in a year of good snowpack and strong releases from Lake Powell, the structural deficit means that Lake Mead can still decline, because the outflow, driven by the enormous lower basin demand and the relentless evaporation, exceeds the inflow. This is a burden that Lake Powell, sitting above, does not bear in the same way, because the upper basin uses less water and the structural imbalance is concentrated in the lower basin, in the accounting of Lake Mead. The structural deficit is the single most important reason why Lake Mead is in more danger than Lake Powell, a persistent downward pressure that presses on the lower reservoir even when the upper one is holding its own. To understand why this structural deficit exists at all, one has to understand the origins of the way the Colorado River was divided, because the deficit is, in a sense, a legacy of decisions made a century ago. When the river was apportioned among the states, the division was based on an estimate of the river's flow that was far too generous, made during an unusually wet period. And the water was divided as though there were more of it than there truly was. The lower basin states were allocated their shares, and Mexico was later guaranteed its share by treaty, and these allocations were set down in law as fixed quantities, entitlements to specific amounts of water. But the accounting that established these entitlements did not fully reckon with the water that would be lost along the way, the water that evaporates from the surface of Lake Mead, the water that seeps into the ground or is lost in the transport through the system. The entitlements were set as though the full allocated amount could be delivered, without subtracting the losses. And so the sum of the deliveries, plus the losses, came to exceed the water that actually flows into Lake Mead. This is the origin of the structural deficit, a mismatch between the paper entitlements and the physical reality of the water, baked into the system by the way it was designed and divided long ago. The structural deficit is therefore not a natural feature of the river, but a human creation, a product of the legal architecture that governs the Colorado, the vast and intricate body of compacts and treaties and court decisions and regulations that is sometimes called the law of the river. This body of law divided the water and established the entitlements, but it did so in a way that promised more than the river could sustainably deliver to Lake Mead once the losses were accounted for, and the result is that the reservoir has been drained by the fulfillment of those legal entitlements, drawn down to deliver the water that the law says the users are owed, even as that delivery, combined with the losses, exceeds what flows in. This is a profound and troubling fact, for it means that the decline of Lake Mead is, in a sense, mandated by law, driven by the legal obligation to deliver the entitled amounts, an obligation that persists even as it drains the reservoir. To close the structural deficit, then, is not merely a technical matter, but a legal and political one, requiring a renegotiation or a reduction of the entitlements that the law established, a confrontation with the century-old division of the water that lies at the foundation of the entire system. This is part of why the deficit has been so hard to close, for it is embedded in the law itself, and undoing it means reopening the fundamental bargains on which the modern West was built. The role of evaporation deserves particular attention, because it is a major component of the structural deficit, and it falls far more heavily on Lake Mead than on Lake Powell. Lake Mead sits in one of the hottest and driest environments on the continent, in the low desert near the Nevada and Arizona border, where the summer temperatures soar to extremes and the air is parched. From the vast surface of the reservoir, exposed to this relentless heat, an enormous quantity of water evaporates every year, rising invisibly into the dry desert air and lost to the system. This evaporation is a constant drain on Lake Mead, a loss that continues regardless of drought or plenty, a subtraction from the reservoir that must be accounted for in the balance of inflow and outflow. And because Lake Mead sits lower and in a hotter environment than Lake Powell, the evaporative losses from Mead are severe, adding to the outflow side of the ledger and deepening the structural deficit. Lake Powell, sitting higher and in a somewhat less extreme environment, also loses water to evaporation, but the combination of Lake Mead's position, its exposure, and the enormous demand placed upon it makes the pressure on the lower reservoir greater. Evaporation is one more force pressing Lake Mead downward, one more element of the asymmetry that puts it in greater danger. It is worth putting a scale to the structural deficit, because the abstraction of the term can obscure how large and how relentless the drain on Lake Mead actually is. Year after year, in the accounting of the lower basin, the water leaving Lake Mead has exceeded the water arriving by a very substantial margin, a gap large enough that, on its own, without any drought at all, it would draw the reservoir steadily downward over time. This is a loss measured not in trickles but in enormous volumes, a shortfall built into the ordinary operation of the system. The product of decades of accounting that never fully reckoned with the water lost to evaporation and to the movement of the water through the system. Imagine a bank account from which more is withdrawn each month than is deposited, not because of any unusual expense, but simply because the routine withdrawals exceed the routine deposits. Such an account would dwindle inexorably toward zero, and no ordinary month of good fortune would save it, because the imbalance is built into its very operation. This is the situation of Lake Mead, an account structurally destined to shrink, and it is a situation that Lake Powell, whose upper basin takes less than its full share, does not face in anything like the same degree. The structural deficit is the mathematical heart of Mead's greater danger, a persistent subtraction that no single good year can overcome. The consequences of the structural deficit have been visible for years in the steady, grinding decline of Lake Mead, a decline that has continued even through periods when one might have expected the reservoir to recover. Observers have watched the level of Lake Mead fall almost inexorably over the long years of the crisis. The white bathtub ring around its shores growing ever taller as the water dropped, the boat ramps stranded on dry land, the marinas relocated again and again as the shoreline retreated. This relentless decline, continuing year after year, is the structural deficit made visible, the physical manifestation of an account being steadily drained. And it stands in a certain contrast to Lake Powell, which, while it too has fallen dramatically, is driven more directly by the ups and downs of the inflow from the mountains, rising more noticeably in the better years and falling in the worse. Lake Mead's decline has a more remorseless quality to it, a steadiness that reflects the structural nature of its predicament. The fact that it is drained not only by drought, but by the built-in imbalance of the lower basin's demand. The visible evidence of the two reservoirs tells the story of their different dangers, the one falling with the fluctuations of the weather, the other declining with the remorselessness of a structural deficit. There is another dimension to the asymmetry between the two reservoirs that is crucial to understand, and it concerns what stands above each of them in the river system, the reserves that can be called upon to prop each reservoir up in a crisis. Lake Powell, sitting in the upper part of the system, has above it a series of other reservoirs in the upper basin. Smaller reservoirs on the tributaries of the Colorado that can, in an emergency, release water downstream to help prop up the level of Lake Powell. In the crisis of recent years, water has indeed been released from these upstream reservoirs to bolster Lake Powell, drawing on the reserves that sit above it to keep the great reservoir from falling too low. Lake Powell, in other words, has a backstop above it, a set of reserves that can be tapped to support it in a crisis. Lake Mead, by contrast, has only one reservoir above it that matters, and that is Lake Powell itself. If Lake Mead is falling and needs to be propped up, the only major source of additional water to support it is a release from Lake Powell. But if Lake Powell is also low, as it has been in the crisis, then there is little extra water to send down to Mead, and the lower reservoir is left exposed, without the backstop that Powell enjoys. This difference in what stands above each reservoir is another element of Lake Mead's greater danger, for it sits at the bottom of the chain, with less to catch it if it falls. One might ask why Lake Mead cannot simply be given a larger share of the releases from Lake Powell to make up for its greater demand, and the answer reveals the trap in which the lower reservoir is caught. Any water sent down from Powell to bolster Mead is water taken from Powell, and in a system where both reservoirs are stressed, there is no surplus to draw upon. To fill Mead by draining Powell would simply shift the danger from the lower reservoir to the upper, threatening the very source on which Mead depends for its inflow, for if Powell falls too low to release water reliably, Mead is cut off entirely. So the releases cannot simply be increased without limit to save Mead, because doing so would endanger Powell. And endangering Powell endangers Mead in turn. The two are locked together, and the water that would save one can only be taken from the other, which means that neither can be truly secured by shuffling water between them. The only real escape from this trap is to reduce the total demand on the system, so that less must be drawn from Mead in the first place. Relieving the pressure that forces the impossible choice between draining Powell and starving Mead. This is why the balancing of the reservoirs, for all its ingenuity, cannot solve the crisis, and why the reduction of demand is the only true remedy. It is worth dwelling on this point because it reveals a stark truth about Lake Mead's position at the bottom of the system. Being the downstream reservoir, the last major storage before the water is delivered to the users and lost to the sea, Lake Mead occupies the most exposed position in the entire chain. Everything above it, all the reserves of the upper basin and Lake Powell itself, can in principle be marshaled to send water down to it, but only if those upstream reserves have water to spare. In a deep and prolonged crisis, when the whole system is stressed and the upstream reserves are themselves depleted, Lake Mead is left at the end of the line, drawing on whatever trickles down from above, while the enormous lower basin demand continues to pull it down. It has nothing below it and nothing beside it, only the depleted reserves above, and if those reserves cannot supply enough, Lake Mead has no other recourse. This position at the bottom of the chain, the most downstream of all the great storage, is fundamental to why Lake Mead is in more danger, for it bears the full weight of the lower basin's demand with the least support behind it. There is a further aspect of the losses from Lake Mead that deepens its predicament, beyond the evaporation from the surface of the reservoir itself, and that is the losses that occur along the long journey the water must take from the reservoir to the users who depend on it. When water is released from Lake Mead and travels down the river and through the canals and aqueducts to reach the distant cities and farms, some of it is lost along the way, seeping into the ground, evaporating from the surface of the channels, absorbed by the vegetation along the banks. These conveyance losses, the water lost in transit, are a further subtraction that must be accounted for, and they add to the total that must be drawn from Lake Mead to satisfy the users. The lower basin is a vast area, and the water must travel great distances to reach its destinations, and over those distances the losses accumulate, so that more water must leave Lake Mead than actually arrives at the taps and the fields. This is one more way in which the lower basins demand, and the losses that accompany it, press upon Lake Mead one more component of the outflow that drives the structural deficit and drains the reservoir. The upper basin, with its water used closer to the source and its different arrangement of storage and delivery, does not impose quite the same pattern of losses on Lake Powell, another element of the asymmetry. The enormous demand of the lower basin, which is the force draining Lake Mead, deserves closer examination because it is far larger and, in an important sense, far less flexible than the demand placed on the upper basin's supply. The lower basin is home to the great desert metropolises, to Las Vegas and Phoenix, and the sprawling cities of Southern California that draw on the Colorado River, along with some of the most productive and water-intensive agriculture in the country. This is an enormous demand, a thirst of tens of millions of people and millions of acres of farmland, and it is a demand that is difficult to reduce quickly, because it is embedded in the cities and the farms and the economies that have grown up around the availability of the water. The upper basin, by contrast, uses considerably less water, with a smaller population and less intensive development, and its demand, while real, is smaller in absolute terms. This means that the pressure draining Lake Mead is greater than the pressure draining Lake Powell, because the lower basin that Mead supplies simply uses more water than the upper basin that Powell serves. The sheer magnitude of the lower basin's demand is one more reason why Lake Mead is in greater danger, for it is the outflow that this demand represents that presses the reservoir down. It is worth looking more closely at the composition of the lower basin's demand because it reveals why reducing it is so difficult and why the pressure on Lake Mead is so hard to relieve. The largest share of the water drawn from Lake Mead goes not to the cities, but to agriculture, to the vast farms of the lower basin that grow crops in the desert on the strength of the river's water. This agricultural demand is enormous, dwarfing the urban demand in sheer volume, and it is embedded in an entire economy and way of life, in the livelihoods of farmers and the communities that depend on them, in the food that these farms produce for the nation and the world. Reducing the agricultural demand means fallowing fields, taking land out of production, changing the crops that are grown, all of which carry heavy economic and social costs and provoke fierce resistance from those who would bear them. The urban demand, while smaller, is also difficult to reduce, embedded as it is in the growth and the prosperity of the great desert cities, though the cities have in many cases done more to conserve than the farms. The point is that the demand draining Lake Mead is not a single simple thing that can be easily turned down, but a vast and complex web of uses, each with its own defenders and its own inertia, and this is why the pressure on the reservoir has been so persistent and so hard to relieve. The inflexibility of this demand is one of the cruelest aspects of Lake Mead's predicament, for it means that the force draining the reservoir cannot easily be reduced even as the danger grows more acute. When a reservoir is threatened by drought alone, the hope is always that the drought will end and the inflow will return. But when it is threatened by a structural demand that exceeds the sustainable supply, the only remedy is to reduce that demand. And reducing it means asking people to give up water they have long depended on, to follow their fields and curtail their growth and change their ways. This is a far harder thing than simply waiting for the rains, and it is the reason the crisis of Lake Mead has been so intractable. The reservoir is drained by a demand that is deeply entrenched, difficult to reduce, defended by powerful interests, and embedded in the law that governs the river, and this entrenchment is what makes Mead's danger so much more than a passing crisis, a structural predicament that will yield only to a fundamental and painful reordering of how the lower basin uses its water. Now, it is important to introduce a note of nuance and complexity here, because the relationship between the two reservoirs is not entirely one-sided, and the managers of the system have taken deliberate steps to balance the two, which complicates the simple picture of Mead's greater danger. Because the two reservoirs are linked, and because the health of the whole system depends on both of them. The operators of the dams and the negotiators of the water agreements have sought to manage the two reservoirs in a coordinated way, adjusting the releases from Lake Powell to help balance the levels of the two reservoirs and to keep either one from falling too far ahead of the other. In the crisis of recent years, decisions have been made to reduce the releases from Lake Powell in order to keep more water in the upper reservoir, and at other times to increase the releases to send more water down to Mead, all in an effort to balance the two and to preserve the essential functions of both. This coordinated management means that the fate of the two reservoirs is intertwined, and that the danger to Lake Mead cannot be considered entirely in isolation from the management of Lake Powell above it. But this coordination, while it complicates the picture, does not eliminate the fundamental asymmetry, for the structural deficit and the enormous lower basin demand still press on Lake Mead with a force that has no equal on the upper reservoir. Indeed, the very effort to balance the two reservoirs reveals the depth of Lake Mead's structural predicament, because the need to send water down from Powell to prop up Mead is itself a sign of how relentlessly Mead is drained. When the managers reduce the releases from Powell to protect the upper reservoir, they do so at the cost of sending less water to Mead, which accelerates the decline of the lower reservoir. When they increase the releases to protect Mead, they draw down Powell more quickly, threatening the upper reservoir. The two are locked in a kind of tug-of-war, and the enormous demand on Mead means that keeping it stable requires constant infusions from above, infusions that can only come at the expense of Powell. This dynamic reveals that Lake Mead, left to itself, would decline faster than Lake Powell, precisely because of the structural deficit and the lower basin demand, and that keeping it from falling requires drawing on the reserves above it. The balancing act is a testament to Mead's greater vulnerability, not a refutation of it. For it is Mead that must be constantly supported to keep it from falling, Mead that is the more precarious of the two. The rules that govern how the two reservoirs are balanced deserve a closer look, because they reveal how the managers of the system have tried to share the burden of the decline between the two, and why, despite those efforts, Lake Mead remains the more exposed. Over the years, elaborate rules have been developed to determine how much water is released from Lake Powell to Lake Mead each year. Rules that take into account the levels of both reservoirs and seek to keep them in a rough balance, so that neither falls too far while the other stays high. In some years, when Lake Powell is relatively full and Lake Mead is low, more water is released to bring the two into balance, sending extra water down to bolster the lower reservoir. In other years, when both are low, the releases are reduced to protect the upper reservoir at the cost of sending less to Mead. These balancing rules are an attempt to manage the two reservoirs as a single system, to spread the pain of the decline between them rather than letting one collapse while the other holds. And they have, at times, worked to Lake Mead's benefit, sending water down to prop it up when it fell too low. But the balancing rules, for all their sophistication, cannot overcome the fundamental asymmetry, because they can only redistribute the water that exists within the system, not create more of it. When the whole system is in deficit, when both reservoirs are falling, balancing the two simply means sharing a shrinking pool between them, and the enormous demand on Lake Mead means that its share is drained away faster than it can be replenished. The balancing rules can slow the decline of Lake Mead by sending it water from Powell, but only by accelerating the decline of Powell, and in a deep and prolonged crisis there comes a point at which there is not enough water in the upper reservoir to keep propping up the lower one without endangering Powell itself. At that point, the balancing act reaches its limit, and Lake Mead is left to face the full force of the structural deficit and the lower basin demand with whatever water remains. The rules can manage the distribution of the shortage, but they cannot eliminate it, and the shortage falls, in the end, most heavily on the reservoir that bears the greatest demand, which is Lake Mead. There is also the matter of the tribal nations and their water rights, which adds a further layer of complexity to the demands on the system and to the challenge of resolving the crisis. Across the Colorado River Basin, many tribal nations hold rights to the water, some of them very senior rights, rights that in some cases have not been fully quantified or fully used. And these rights represent a significant claim on the river that must be honored as the crisis is addressed. The recognition and the fulfillment of these tribal water rights is a matter of justice long deferred, and it is also a factor in the accounting of the water. For as these rights are quantified and used, they represent additional demand on a system already stretched beyond its limits. The tribal nations have a rightful place at the table in the negotiations over the future of the river, and their claims add both moral weight and practical complexity to the effort to bring the demands on the water into balance with what the river can provide. The presence of these long-standing and often senior claims is one more dimension of the demand that presses on the system. One more consideration that must be reckoned with in any effort to close the structural deficit that endangers Lake Mead. There is a further consideration that bears on the comparison, and it concerns the consequences of each reservoir reaching its critical levels, for the dangers that lie at the bottom of each reservoir are not identical, and this too shapes the picture of relative danger. Both reservoirs face the threshold of minimum power pool, below which their dams can no longer generate electricity, and the even lower threshold of dead pool, below which water can no longer pass through the dams at all. For Lake Powell, there is a distinctive danger at the low levels concerning the outlets through which water must be released when the reservoir falls below the level of the power intakes, outlets that were not designed for sustained heavy use, raising questions about the ability to release water downstream. This is a serious concern specific to Glen Canyon Dam. But for Lake Mead, the danger of reaching the critical levels is the direct and immediate threat to the water supply of the entire lower basin, for it is Mead that delivers water to the great cities and farms directly, and its fall to dead pool would cut off that delivery at the source. Because Lake Mead is the reservoir that directly supplies the enormous lower basin demand. The consequences of its decline are felt most immediately and most acutely by the tens of millions who depend on it, which adds to the sense in which Mead's danger is the more pressing. Let us step back and assemble the full picture of why Lake Mead is in more danger than Lake Powell, because the reasons, taken together, form a compelling and sobering case. Lake Mead sits at the bottom of the chain, the downstream reservoir, fed not by the natural bounty of the mountains, but by the managed releases from above, dependent on what is sent down to it. It bears the enormous demand of the lower basin, the vast thirst of the great desert cities, and the sprawling farms, a demand far larger than that placed on the upper basin. It suffers the relentless drain of the structural deficit, taking more water out each year than flows in, even in normal times, a built-in decline that persists regardless of drought. It loses an enormous quantity of water to evaporation in the blazing heat of the low desert, a constant subtraction that deepens the deficit. And it sits at the bottom of the chain, with the least support behind it, dependent on the depleted reserves above it, with nothing to catch it if it falls. Every one of these factors presses Lake Mead downward, and together they place it in a position of greater and more persistent danger than Lake Powell, which sits higher, drinks from the source, bears a smaller demand, and has more reserves above it to call upon. It is worth dwelling on the specific dangers that would unfold if Lake Mead were to continue its decline toward the critical thresholds, because the consequences illuminate just how much rides on the fate of this one reservoir. As Lake Mead falls, it first approaches the level at which Hoover Dam can no longer generate hydroelectric power, the loss of which would remove a significant source of electricity from the regional grid and raise costs for the communities that depend on it. Below that lies the level of dead pool, at which water can no longer pass through the dam at all, at which point the delivery of water to the entire lower basin would be cut off at the source. A catastrophe almost beyond imagining for the tens of millions who depend on that water. Because Lake Mead is the reservoir that directly supplies the great cities and the vast farms of the lower basin, its fall to these critical levels would strike immediately at the water supply of the desert Southwest, threatening the taps of Las Vegas and Phoenix and the cities of Southern California. The fields of the great agricultural valleys, the water owed to Mexico. The stakes of Lake Mead's decline are thus enormous and immediate, a direct threat to the water on which an entire civilization depends. The efforts to stave off this catastrophe have been intense and ongoing, and they reveal both the seriousness of the danger and the difficulty of resolving it. The states of the lower basin have negotiated agreements to reduce their use of the water, to leave more of it in Lake Mead, to share the burden of the cuts among themselves. Emergency measures have been taken, water has been left in the reservoir that would otherwise have been used, and the federal government has pressed the states to do more, threatening to impose cuts if they cannot agree among themselves. These efforts have, at times, slowed the decline of Lake Mead, and a few better winters have brought more water into the system and offered a reprieve from the most immediate danger. But the fundamental problem, the structural deficit, has not been resolved, and the reservoir remains far below its historic levels, still vulnerable to a return of severe drought. The efforts to save Lake Mead are a testament to the gravity of its danger, a scramble to prevent a catastrophe that the region cannot afford, but they are also a reminder that the underlying imbalance remains, that the reservoir is still drained by a demand that exceeds its sustainable supply, and that only a lasting reduction in that demand can truly secure its future. What would it actually take to close the structural deficit and stabilize Lake Mead, to relieve the relentless pressure that makes it so much more endangered than Lake Powell? The answer is a dramatic reduction in the amount of water drawn from the reservoir. A reduction large enough to bring the outflow into balance with the inflow, and this means finding ways to use far less water in the lower basin. It means conservation in the cities, the kind of aggressive efficiency that some have already embraced, tearing out lawns, recycling water, driving down per capita use. It means, above all, a reckoning with agriculture, which uses the largest share of the water, a shift toward less thirsty crops, more efficient irrigation, and in some cases the following of land, the taking of fields out of production so that the water they would have used can remain in the reservoir. It means, perhaps, paying farmers to use less, compensating them for the water they forgo, and finding ways to cushion the economic blow to the communities affected. And it means, ultimately, confronting the legal entitlements that mandate the deliveries, renegotiating the century-old division of the water to bring it into line with the physical reality of a shrinking river. All of this is difficult, painful, and contentious, which is why it has been so slow to happen. But it is what the danger to Lake Mead demands, for only by reducing the demand can the structural deficit be closed and the reservoir be saved. This asymmetry between the two reservoirs is not merely a technical curiosity, but a matter of profound consequence for the future of the American West, because it reveals where the deepest structural problem of the Colorado River lies, and thus where the solution must be focused. The structural deficit in the lower basin. The fact that more water is taken from Lake Mead each year than flows into it is the heart of the crisis, the fundamental imbalance that must be corrected if the system is to be stabilized. It is not enough to hope for better snow years, because even good snow years do not eliminate the structural deficit, do not stop Lake Mead from declining under the weight of the lower basin's demand and the losses to evaporation. The only way to truly stabilize Lake Mead is to reduce the demand placed upon it, to bring the lower basin's use of the water into balance with what the reservoir actually receives, to close the structural deficit that presses the reservoir down. This is the great and difficult task at the heart of the Colorado River crisis, and the danger to Lake Mead points directly to it, showing that the lower basin and its enormous and largely inflexible demand is where the reckoning must ultimately occur. It is worth noting, too, that the very fame and prominence of Lake Mead adds a dimension to its danger, for it is the reservoir most directly tied to the daily lives of the greatest number of people. Lake Mead sits just outside Las Vegas, supplies the water for that great city and for the millions of the lower basin, and is bound up with Hoover Dam, one of the most iconic structures in the country. When Lake Mead falls, it is felt and seen and reported in a way that touches the lives of tens of millions directly. For it is their water, their reservoir, the source on which their cities and farms immediately depend. Lake Powell, sitting in the more remote canyon country upstream, is no less important to the system, but its decline is one step removed from the immediate delivery of water to the great population centers. This means that the danger to Lake Mead is not only structurally greater, but also more immediate in its human consequences, more directly threatening to the water that flows from the taps of the desert cities. It is worth reflecting, too, on the human dimension of Lake Mead's greater danger, on what it would mean for the millions of people whose lives are bound to the reservoir if the structural deficit is not addressed and the decline continues. Behind the abstractions of inflow and outflow and structural deficit are the daily lives of tens of millions of people, the families in the desert cities who turn on their taps each day, the farmers who irrigate their fields, the workers in the industries that depend on the water, the communities that have grown up around the availability of the river. If Lake Mead were to fall to the critical levels, these are the people who would bear the consequences, facing restrictions and rationing, rising costs, and in the worst case, the genuine threat of scarcity in a place where water has always seemed assured. The greater danger to Lake Mead is not an abstract matter of hydrology, but a threat to the way of life of an entire region, to the millions who have built their homes and their livelihoods on the assumption that the water would always be there. This human dimension is what gives the danger its true weight, what makes the structural deficit not merely a technical problem, but a looming threat to the security and the prosperity of the American Southwest. The story of Lake Mead's greater danger also carries a lesson about the importance of understanding the true nature of a crisis, of looking beneath the surface to the structural forces at work, rather than being deceived by appearances. To the casual observer, the two reservoirs might seem to share the same fate, both falling in the drought, both the subject of the same worry. And one might conclude that they are equally endangered, and that the return of the rains would save them both. But this surface impression is misleading, for it misses the structural deficit that makes Lake Mead's danger deeper and more persistent, that ensures its decline even in good years, that requires a fundamentally different response than merely waiting for the drought to end. Understanding the true nature of Lake Mead's danger, seeing beneath the surface to the structural imbalance that drives it, is essential to responding to it correctly, to recognizing that the solution lies not in hoping for better weather, but in reducing the demand that drains the reservoir. This is why the comparison between the two reservoirs matters so much, for it reveals the structural truth that must guide the response, the recognition that Lake Mead's danger is of a different and more intractable kind, and that it demands a different and more fundamental solution. The comparison between the two reservoirs also illuminates why the crisis of the Colorado River has been so persistent and so difficult to resolve, because it shows that the problem is not simply a matter of waiting for the drought to end. If the danger to Lake Mead were purely a function of drought, then the return of wet years would refill the reservoir and end the crisis. But because the danger to Lake Mead is structural, rooted in the deficit that drains it even in normal years, the crisis persists even when the snows are good, even when Lake Powell above is holding its own. The structural deficit means that Lake Mead is on a downward trajectory that only a reduction in demand can reverse, and this is why the crisis has been so stubborn, why the reservoir has kept falling toward the critical levels despite the occasional good year. The recognition that Lake Mead is in more danger than Lake Powell is, at its core. A recognition that the lower basin's demand exceeds its sustainable supply, a structural truth that no amount of good weather can change, and that only a fundamental reduction in the taking of the water can address. There is a deeper reflection to be drawn from the story of Lake Mead's greater danger, one that speaks to the nature of the entire enterprise of taming the Colorado River and building a civilization in the desert. The great dams and reservoirs were monuments to a supreme confidence, an age that believed the natural world could be engineered to serve human needs without limit, that a wild river could be captured and made to yield an endless supply. And for a long time, that confidence seemed justified, for the reservoirs filled and the water flowed and the cities and the farms flourished in a place that should never have supported them. But the structural deficit reveals the flaw in that confidence, the assumption that the water would always be sufficient, that the losses could be ignored, that more could be taken than the river truly provided. Lake Mead, the workhorse of the lower basin, is where that flawed assumption comes home to roost, where the gap between the promise and the reality is drawn down year after year, where the limits that the engineers thought they had overcome reassert themselves in the falling level of the reservoir. The greater danger to Lake Mead is, in this sense, a judgment on the whole enterprise, a reminder that the natural world cannot be engineered without limit, that a river can be asked to give only so much, and that the reckoning, long deferred, eventually arrives. There is also something to be learned from the contrast between the two reservoirs about the nature of risk and vulnerability in complex systems, a lesson that reaches beyond the Colorado River to any system in which resources are drawn down faster than they are replenished. Lake Powell, sitting at the top, is exposed to the fluctuations of the inflow. Rising and falling with the fortunes of the mountain snows, its danger tied to the variability of nature. Lake Mead, sitting at the bottom, is exposed to something more insidious, a structural imbalance that drains it regardless of the weather, a built-in deficit that no good year can fully overcome. The one faces a danger that comes and goes with the drought. The other faces a danger that is always present, woven into the very operation of the system. And it is the structural danger, the persistent imbalance, that is the more dangerous of the two, precisely because it does not relent, because it cannot be waited out, because it will continue to press the reservoir down until it is addressed at its root. This is a lesson worth heeding, that the most dangerous vulnerabilities are often not the dramatic ones, the sudden shocks and the visible crises, but the quiet structural imbalances that erode a system from within, steadily and relentlessly, until the reckoning can no longer be avoided. It is worth pausing to consider what the two reservoirs would look like at their most depleted, to imagine the physical reality of the danger that Lake Mead faces. Already, the decline of the reservoir has transformed the landscape around it, exposing vast expanses of pale rock and sediment that had been underwater for generations, revealing sunken wrecks and long submerged landscapes, stranding the boat ramps and the marinas far from the retreating shore. The white bathtub ring that marks the old high water level rises like a ghostly monument high above the current surface, a stark measure of how far the reservoir has fallen. Were the decline to continue toward the critical levels, the reservoir would shrink to a fraction of its former self, a diminished pool in the bottom of a vast basin, its once great expanse reduced to a remnant. This is the physical face of the danger, the visible evidence of a reservoir being drained faster than it can be filled, and it is a sight that has already drawn the attention and the alarm of a nation, a warning written in the exposed rock, and the falling water of what the structural deficit and the relentless demand are doing to the keystone reservoir of the American West. It is important, having laid out this case, to acknowledge the ways in which the fates of the two reservoirs remain intertwined, so that the picture is not oversimplified. The two reservoirs are, in the end, part of a single system, and the health of each depends on the other. If Lake Powell above were to fall so low that it could no longer reliably release water downstream, then Lake Mead would be starved of its inflow and would decline all the faster, so the danger to Powell is also, indirectly, a danger to Mead. And the coordinated management of the two reservoirs means that decisions about one directly affect the other, that the two must be considered together in any effort to stabilize the system. So while Lake Mead is in more danger in the specific sense that the structural deficit and the lower basin demand press it down more relentlessly, the two reservoirs are ultimately bound together, and the salvation of one requires the salvation of both. The greater danger to Lake Mead does not mean that Lake Powell is safe, only that the particular forces bearing on the lower reservoir are more severe, and that the structural heart of the crisis lies in the lower basin that Mead supplies. There is a question that naturally arises from all of this, which is whether the asymmetry could ever reverse, whether there are circumstances under which Lake Powell might come to be in greater danger than Lake Mead. It is a worthwhile question because it tests the robustness of the analysis and reveals the conditions on which it depends. Lake Powell could indeed become the more immediately threatened of the two under certain circumstances, most notably if the inflow from the mountains were to collapse in a severe and sustained drought while the upstream reserves that support it ran dry, leaving it starved of water even as it tried to meet its obligation to release water downstream. In such a scenario, the upper reservoir could fall rapidly toward its own critical levels, and the distinctive danger of its outlet works could come to the fore. So the danger to Lake Powell is real and must not be dismissed, and there are circumstances under which it could become acute. But even so, the structural deficit that drains Lake Mead would remain. An ever-present force pulling the lower reservoir down, and the fundamental point would hold that Lake Mead bears a persistent structural burden that Lake Powell does not, a burden that makes its long-term danger the more inexorable. The asymmetry could shift in its particulars, but the deep structural truth that the lower basin takes more than the system can sustainably provide would endure. Ultimately, the comparison between the two reservoirs is valuable not because it pits one against the other in some contest of doom, but because it directs attention to where the crisis is most structural and where the solution must be focused. To say that Lake Mead is in more danger than Lake Powell is to say that the deepest problem of the Colorado River lies in the lower basin, in the demand that exceeds the supply, in the structural deficit that drains the Keystone Reservoir even in good years. It is to say that the crisis will not be solved by weather alone, by hoping for the return of the wet years, but only by a fundamental reduction in the demand placed on the water, a reckoning with the entitlements and the uses that drain Lake Mead beyond what the river can sustain. This is the great lesson of the asymmetry. The recognition that the heart of the crisis lies in the structural imbalance of the lower basin, and that the salvation of Lake Mead and of the entire system it anchors depends on confronting that imbalance at its root. So why is Lake Mead in more danger than Lake Powell? Because it sits at the bottom of the chain, the downstream reservoir, fed by managed releases rather than the natural flow, bearing the enormous and inflexible demand of the lower basin, drained by a structural deficit that takes more water out each year than flows even in normal times, losing vast quantities to evaporation in the blazing desert heat, and sitting with the least support behind it, dependent on the depleted reserves above. These forces, taken together, press Lake Mead downward with a relentless and persistent force that has no equal on Lake Powell above it, placing the lower reservoir in a position of greater and more structural danger. And the recognition of this asymmetry points to the deepest truth of the Colorado River crisis, that the fundamental problem lies in the lower basin, in the enormous demand that exceeds the sustainable supply, in the structural deficit that must be closed if Lake Mead and the entire system it anchors is to be saved. The danger to Lake Mead is a warning written in the falling level of the reservoir, a warning that the lower basin has been taking more water than the system can provide, and that only a reckoning with that fundamental imbalance can pull the great reservoir back from the edge. In the end, the story of why Lake Mead is in more danger than Lake Powell is the story of the deep structure of the Colorado River crisis, of the asymmetry between the upper basin and the lower, of the relentless demand and the persistent deficit that press upon the downstream reservoir. It is a story that most people do not know, obscured by the common image of the two reservoirs as twins sharing a single fate, but it is a story that matters enormously, because it points to where the crisis is most acute and where the solution must be focused. Lake Mead, the keystone of the lower basin, the reservoir that directly supplies the great cities and farms of the desert Southwest, sits in the more precarious position. pressed down by forces that its upstream sibling does not face in the same measure. And its greater danger is a call to action, a reminder that the lower basin must confront the structural deficit that drains its keystone reservoir, must bring its use of the water into balance with what the system can sustainably provide, before the relentless downward pressure on Lake Mead brings the great reservoir, and the civilization that depends upon it, to the brink. The two reservoirs may be spoken of as twins, but they are not equally endangered, and understanding why is essential to understanding the true nature of the crisis that grips the Colorado River and the American West. To grasp the asymmetry between them is to grasp the deepest logic of the crisis, to see past the surface impression of two reservoirs falling together, and to recognize the structural forces that press the lower one down with a special and relentless severity. And to recognize those forces is to understand where the effort to save the system must be concentrated, in the lower basin, in the reduction of the demand that drains Lake Mead beyond what the river can bear. The falling level of Lake Mead is the clearest gauge of the crisis, the place where the imbalance shows itself